Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Fandom Track here at ConTinual. I'm your host, Gail Z. Martin, and with us today we have got the author-editor of Supernatural Philosophy, and I'm going to let Galen do his introduction. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Galen Foresman. I edited Supernatural and Philosophy through Wiley Blackwell Publishing, and I've been a fan of Supernatural since it started. I was in graduate school when it started, and I had to stop watching it because I had a grad class when it came on, and I refused to go back and watch it until I could stream a lot of it all at once. And so for years, I would see a minute or two of it on television. I would turn it off. I'm like, no, I'm gonna watch this when I'm ready. Finally, Netflix got it, and I watched all of it that was available at the time, and I said, this is perfect for a book that incorporates philosophical issues that are going on in the show. So yeah, it was a lot of fun, but it was actually a long time in coming.
As good things are. Now, what's your background in terms of philosophy to tackle the subject and kind of see those elements in Supernatural?
Well, I have I have a doctorate in philosophy, and more specifically applied philosophy, which tends to be mostly in the area of ethics.
Mm-hmm.
That area, to my mind, touches on a lot of different areas of philosophy. So it isn't just all about what the right thing to do is. You have to understand what sort of thing or person you're dealing with, and you have to understand um, things about religion. You have to understand uh, the big thing you have to understand is relationships, and how relationships between people and among people work, as well as some of the broader social implications of those relationships. And the show, like most great shows, is really dealing with a lot of those issues all of the time, and the way it manages to juggle those different ideas in different episodes over this 15 season history has really been a testament, I think, to some of the writing, and um, the characters, which sometimes are what get me to watch the next episode, even when I'm very upset from the last episode.
I think we're all with you on that one.
Yes.
Now, I had to laugh. You know, you open the book and you're primed to read a serious tome on philosophy and supernatural, and it begins with an introduction as an honorary ghost facer. That's ghost facer with a PH.
Yes.
How on earth did you decide to do it that way?
I love the ghost facers, and I love sort of the over the top naivete that they have for handling things in a very serious way that looks ridiculous. So I knew I had to write an opening to the book, and I knew it needed to sort of attract fans. I was met with some resistance from I think it was the series editor, and I said, no, this is good, don't worry about it. I mean, I knew it was a risk. I didn't, when I said good, I may have just been trying to make him feel okay about it, but I I wrote it. I think I wrote it all out all at once. I read through it. I edited some things, but For me, it was just that was just fun. And those two, or well, not two, the ghost facers and their sort of story that goes into supernatural is at the time was one of my favorite parts. It really was. It's just got this great meta aspect, and it was around the time when all of those ghost chasing shows were on,
Mhm.
and I enjoy some of those as well, but that was just a lot of fun.
Well, I loved it because it was kind of a signal that says, we're going to talk about supernatural. Don't worry about this being too serious. You can handle it. This will still be fun.
Yes.
And I appreciated that. So right off the bat, you get into monsters and the moral community, and you talk about low functioning monsters, antisocial monsters, and moral monsters. Which I think if anybody who's watched the show stops to think about for a minute, they can start maybe classifying some of those on their own. But I'm curious about this whole concept of the moral community when it comes to monsters. So can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I'd love to. And I gotta say, Nathan Stout, the author of that chapter, he and I had an interesting connection. I didn't know this. Uh, I think when I first read his abstract, but he was studying with one of my professors when he wrote it, and that professor, David Shoemaker, his area it was in, or it still is in free will and agency, and the role of agency is something in supernatural that I wrote on as well, and it was definitely inspired by some of the thoughts that Nathan Stout had in this chapter. And agency is fascinating because um, it helps us. Well, there are several different areas of philosophy that handle this, but agency, I think, is what makes a lot of our lives important. It's what allows us to make decisions and choices, and an agent can do that. Um, but that's kind of a broad group. Not all agents are uh, creatures that we would necessarily hold morally responsible. I don't get upset when my cats murder everything outside. Um, I should probably get more upset, but the the way a lot of animals tear up my yard, I'm okay if a cat happens to hunt one down. But should I be morally upset about the cat's behavior? Well, the cat is just acting like a cat. It's not being malicious. I mean, it may play with its prey some, but it's not quite the same as, say, uh, an animal that might kill something else just for the fun of it. Um, and so when we talk about a moral community, generally we're talking about the way agents that are capable of moral reasoning should be expected to engage that community. And that community may include, and I don't mean the morally agent community, just the community of agents, may include some agents that are not yet fully morally rational. You know, children, for example, they're working on it, they're getting there, but we don't hold them responsible in the same way as we would an adult. And some of what um, Nathan is explaining when he talks about the different um, types of agency, and the higher and lower, he's talking about the way in which these monsters are motivated to do what they do is just a part of what they are. And so holding them morally responsible, say for killing humans, isn't entirely fair because that's their food source, for, as one example. You can imagine a monster, say, from a different movie where the only way it could reproduce would be through using a human. I can't then fault them too much for using a human to
Yeah.
reproduce. Now that's a gloss over it, but where it gets interesting in Supernatural is when you look at the different types of monsters that in many cases may have been formerly human and were, you know, and are now wrestling with these issues about, should I be eating humans now that I'm a vampire? You know, and
Well,
I
I just rewatched Bloodlust this morning,
mhm.
and that's the one where where they deal with Lenore, who is a vampire who doesn't want to kill people. And at the end, Dean looks so conflicted when he talks to Sam and says, how many of these monsters did we kill that we shouldn't have? Because they were different, but they weren't really monsters. And so I think if I'm understanding correctly, when you're talking about the low functioning monsters, you're talking about something that's really an unusual beast, something like a Wendigo or a Rougarou that is more like an animal. And then the antisocial ones would have the agency to be malicious, and the moral ones would be more like Lenore or like Garth, who they are paranormal creatures, but they have agency, they have choice, they can decide not to behave in an antisocial way. Am I
Yes,
catching on to this?
yes, that's exactly right. So in moral philosophy, we might say that moral agents are often, that's often used synonymously with persons, not human beings, but what we would call persons. So being a person comes with certain sorts of responsibilities, but it also comes with autonomy and the ability to think and reason through and make what are believed to be free choices. So um, there are a lot of things in mythology that count as persons. So but even in, science fiction, a Wookiee is a person. It's not a human being, but we would hold Chewbacca to the same moral standards that we might hold Luke Skywalker. Um, so that's the kind of idea for personhood and moral agency. And Dean is really, I don't know if it's the writing on the show, because he does seem to waver a lot on monsters. And I know that sounds weird because he does seem to be so black and white, like it's a monster, kill it. But then there are these moments where he's not like that. And then in a next episode, he might be, no, their monsters killed him. And I'm like, but you were just thoughtful before. And I get that, and that's fine, and it's part of the charm. But uh Sam seems to be the one that's far more willing to say, if we give them a chance, if we say, here's the rule, and if you cross it, if you break that rule, we're going to come after you, but we are going to at least give you a chance to follow it, like don't kill humans. Sam is far more inclined to do that. Although then you have Dean struggling with his relationship with Benny later on, who's also a monster, and and I really don't understand why angels wouldn't count as monsters as well as anything else. But
Yeah. Well, then certainly some of them were much more monstrous than some of the demons in the end.
Absolutely,
Of
absolutely.
course, Dean's first big struggle with what makes a monster, aside from Lenore, was when he really had to face Sam's abilities. And
Mm-hmm.
but it's Sammy. And
Right.
he really struggled with that. Although, certainly over the course of 15 years, they both got their chances to be monsters one way or the other and come back from it. And
Absolutely.
but I think early on, Sam probably had some of that compassion, not just from who he was, but knowing he was different after he started to see those differences. if you hope to have that kind of grace for yourself, then you have to extend it to other people as well.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And agency is a theme from the first episode to the very end. It is throughout the entire series. It starts with Sam trying to decide whether or not to go on this great adventure with his brother. And he doesn't want to. He has a life. He's made a choice for himself to leave hunting, go to college. He's now going to go be an attorney. And his brother shows up on the doorstep. And it's just a struggle for Sam for a very long time. To finally be all in. I'm okay. But but the way he it sort of comes to terms with it is that Sam has not chosen to be a hunter. He's a reluctant hunter. He capitulates essentially to his brother and to the state of the world, and he says, you know, this is not the life that I would have chosen for myself, but my doing this is better for society than becoming an attorney. And I don't think anybody can argue with that.
Well, and it really lasts until his conversation with Charlie late in the game when he's chasing Dean around with the mark of Cain, when he says, this is my life and I love it, but I won't do it without my brother. And so he's come to that acceptance that this might not have been the path he saw for himself, but maybe it was where he was supposed to be all along, or at least he's made peace with it.
I think that's absolutely right. So what's interesting about that is the way that is juxtaposed with Dean's journey. Dean doesn't question it from the beginning. He wonders and questions later, and if anybody, so this is in a recent publication that I wrote on Supernatural, I talk about this, but Dean, if anybody knows who he is, it's Dean. Like, he's not complicated. That's very intentional on his part. He knows who he is. He knows what he wants. He knows what he likes, and that's good with him. But when he later learns that Chuck has been pulling the strings all this time, it rocks his world. It completely throws him for the loop, and Sam is fine with it. I mean, he's not fine. He's not excited about it, but he's like, what difference does it make? And that's because Sam from the beginning gave up what he thought his life was going to be, and he came to terms with, this is what I do, and it's helping people. And so in the last season, and one of the last episodes, yeah, it was in the last season, Sam is basically saying to Dean, and I looked this up in several transcripts, and it's the same theme. Sam saying, what difference does it make? We're helping people.
Mm-hmm.
Who cares if Chuck's pulling?
In a way, it's sort of like the person who chooses to go into the military and make it a career, as opposed to the person who is conscripted to fight a war, and may find themselves deeply believing in what they're doing and what they need to stop. And having the person who signed up, went willingly, was a true believer, discovering late in the game that maybe their commanding officer has betrayed them. And I see that parallel with Sam and Dean with the whole hunting piece.
Yeah, that's a beautiful analogy. I think that's yeah. What better analogy than a war analogy? They certainly do battle, and Sam, Sam is conscripted, and he recognizes that, and he comes to terms with it. one thing that through I thought one great surprise in the story was discovering that, um, and we can do spoilers. I assume if
Yeah, like 4 months out. Yes, I think so.
well, I'm not going to go that far. I thought it was great when you learned that Mary was the one who was the hunter
Mhm.
in the family, and that John got pulled in, because that's not what you expect, given how the boys were raised and Mary had died. Um,
Yeah,
that I
yeah,
just
that was a terrific twist. And then finding out that John actually came from a men of letters background. If his father hadn't died in the future, saving Sam and Dean, it gets so complicated when you're a Winchester. Brings me to the
I always forget they have a half brother.
well, so did they for about 10 seasons. There's so many still in hell, William Stratum. The disposable, convenient Winchester brother.
He's very useful in
Yes,
times
yes.
of need. Oh, we've got to kill a Winchester, but can't be Sam or Dean. So
Let's get the disposable Winchester. Yes. Now, one of the items I saw in the book was labeled free will and bad faith, and that kind of plays into the whole idea of choice. But that's just such a great phrase. What are we talking about in terms of supernatural with that?
oh, let's see. Let's see where that one was.
I swear it was a chapter header. I didn't just reach into a paragraph and pull
No,
out.
no, no. I know we did free will. Well, there was team free will and something worth fighting for. I remember that expression as well, and I think, oh, I bet I know which one that was. And this one I think had to do with um, atheism
Mhm.
and arguments from evil that are intended to uh, counter common beliefs about God as all powerful, all knowing, and all loving, and how evil can be happening in the world when you have a God like that, and not say, well, one of those things, three things can't be true. And Chuck is a good example of this. And I don't know that Chuck gets discussed too much there, because we learn a lot more about Chuck later.
Mhm.
But um, the issue that is raised is that, well, if why did God make a world with so much bad stuff in it and so many people suffering because of it? And in the sort of traditional arguments, and one of the more popular ones from the last century, was actually articulated hundreds, if not thousands, of years ago, and that had to do with the fact that God created man with free will, and that free will means that man is responsible for those moral wrongdoings and the suffering that comes from them. Um, and Alvin Planting, a famous philosopher from Notre Dame, wrote a very important piece called "The Free Will Defense" that lays out that argument. And what it does is it shifts responsibility for some kinds of suffering to humans and away from God. And the idea is, if humans having free will causes suffering, which is obviously bad, free will has to be more valuable than the suffering that it causes. So if someone is freely choosing good, that has to be worth it in the great calculations. Um, to allow for the suffering that could occur should a person make a bad choice. And what you want to make of that as to whether or not that somehow defends or lets God off the hook, I think I I think that that was something I wanted to talk about, certainly in an article, but it, it's not clear that it does. And I think that um, I think that so I think the author of that chapter was Fred Curry. I want to put that out there, and he actually was a graduate student with me at Bowling Green State University, and um, it's less tied to what's going on in Supernatural, but I want to applaud Supernatural for dealing with some of these issues, and I love the way they approach what is clearly a Christian, and I don't want to use I want to try to be as neutral as possible about this, but I don't want to be offensive in calling it a mythology, but a Christian worldview without having Jesus involved, which I think is really clever, but it's got all the other parts and pieces. So it's mostly Old Testament God and characters. And then if you look at the Old Testament, God does not seem so nice to a lot of people. So if God is all those three things, don't you think God could have made us such a way that we freely chose better things than we currently do? Like, why not just make us a little kinder, just a little, and we're still freely choosing it. It's just going to happen more often.
Yeah, well, and Old Testament God is definitely a lot more on that black and white, no reprieve. I told you once, you know.
And I think I think they do I liked, I think it was the last episode where Michael talks about how he did that. He inspired a lot of those words while God was gone so that people continued to worship. And um, I thought that was interesting because it starts to raise this issue that about Chuck's relationship to his creation. And I think it's interesting because you can ask the same question to, I grew up in a Episcopal family, so believing in Jesus and God was just normal. And as I got older and I started looking at those beliefs more closely, um, it seemed less normal. It seemed unusual that I would just believe those things, and I still wrestle with these issues. So it's still not clear to me today, but I love thinking about what little so if there was a God, what could we know about that God? And at very least, I think we can jump to the conclusion that God is a creator. Um, and so that God stands in a certain relationship to its creation. And we can describe, I like to play with different analogies that could sort of explain that relationship. So if God is like an artist in this creation, then the work is sort of done or is going to play out. And that's kind of the narrative they give Chuck at first. Chuck is an artist who's telling a great story, or has been trying to tell this great story in many ways, in many worlds, in many universes. And I think that's interesting because of the way it puts that responsibility for all the bad stuff back on Chuck. So even if Sam and Dean think that they are free, and responsible for their choices, ultimately Chuck is pulling the strings. And so it's unclear, I think, who is responsible for the bad stuff when bad stuff happens. And that really muddies the waters as we go. And just to tie this back to something we were talking about earlier, I mean, this is why Dean's black and white view of monsters doesn't work. Because it does come down to, what is the thing? What did it do? What was it responsible for? And what can we hold it responsible for?
Which brings me to the other question that I really loved in there about moral responsibility and anguish. Now, the Winchesters have lots of anguish and lots of angst, and a lot of it wrapped around who did what to whom and why, and should you blame them for it, and were they responsible for it, whether it's drinking demon blood or letting Lucifer out or not having a soul and not knowing it, or taking the mark of Cain. So weigh in on that, if you would, please, on moral responsibility and anguish. That doesn't sound like it's a whole lot of fun being morally responsible.
No, I try to be as little responsible as possible, because it is not fun. And taking on moral responsibility often means accepting that you're not good enough, that you cannot make everything right, and that you're going to fail over and over and over again. And those two brothers, their family, their friends, they suffer willingly over and over to do what they think is right. In a game that we later learn is fixed against them. I mean, I think it's pretty clear from the apocalypse, but it continues to be that way, that Chuck is pulling these strings, and that all of their suffering is because of him. But again, this gets back to why it's important that Sam says, who cares? We're still doing good. And that seems to still be within our power, and to walk away from that, to choose otherwise, to say, forget it, I'm done with this, is to let people die that you could have saved. And I think that, yeah.
And something that Dean emphasizes quite a bit, especially in the early seasons, is that they know about the things that go bump in the night, so normal people don't have to be burdened by that knowledge.
Yeah.
And so they have the responsibility because they know about it, but they are maintaining the innocence of the civilians to go about their happy lives, not thinking about what's under the bed.
Yeah, and for many seasons, I don't understand why Dean thinks that's important. I don't
It
understand.
always reminded me of maybe somebody who was in covert operations, who had seen the worst of what people can do, who takes on that stain to keep it from happening, or keeping other people from having to deal with it.
Yeah, I always wonder though. I think you're right. That's Dean's view of it. I wonder if the world wouldn't be better off if it knew.
They got
like
a lot
what
faster.
like
They got a lot faster by getting people to talk.
we can start organizing these. We can start organizing hunting parties. We can keep the lights on. We can keep stuff in our house to keep ourselves safe. I think a public service announcement about salt would be a great idea. They could probably save a lot of lives with that. They could be a lot more effective as hunters if they did a little more ghost facing than.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by, like, I don't quite understand that aspect of it. that Dean is very willing to do this job. Like you said, it's almost as though he's doing it for different reasons, right? He may say so other people don't have to deal with this, but that's not really why Dean's doing it. Dean's doing it because Dean doesn't know any other life. If you ask, I mean, he does try a normal life, but you just don't see Dean quitting because he'd rather do something else. He doesn't think of himself as someone who can do school. You know, he's great with cars. He may want to do that, but I think that what his life would lose without the hunting is so much of a part of his identity that I think that that's more what drives them than the good that they do. As much lip service as they may give to that, I just, it's not as genuine from Dean's lips as Sam's. And I say that as a huge Dean fan. Like, I Dean's definitely my favorite. Um, but he's
There's an aspect, especially as we get into some of the later seasons with both boys, about doing good as penance. Because by the time you get into some of the later seasons, they both have also done some pretty bad things.
oh
And
yeah.
feel a great deal of guilt and responsibility, even if they have ostensibly forgiven each other. And so it seems like in some of the later seasons, one of the things that drives them is trying to make up for their mistakes by continuing the good fight, as one more layer of
They,
responsibility.
yeah, they seem to always be chasing after a mistake they just made.
Mhm.
You know, we're going to solve this huge problem, but one of us is going to die in the process. And then we know what the next thing is going to be is trying to get that one back. And that's going to cause another problem. So they're always saving the world at the cost of something that they later try to fix. And then problems come from that as well. And as far as the penance goes, I I think that's a great observation. I know that Dean talks about his time in hell, and it makes you very well, for me. um, I became a lot more sympathetic to the demon, uh, knowing how they became demons, um, and that part of their suffering was that they were forced to cause others to suffer until they liked it. And that's what Dean says at one point. He's like, I got to where I liked it, and that's where he felt incredibly, that that's what he took from his time in hell that bothered him so much. um I think they were dealing with Alistair at that time because
Mhm.
he had been one of the ones that had been torturing Dean. And um and yeah, so after that, it's a matter of, we have to do this because partly we caused this problem to get our mom back or to do something else, but partly because we've done stuff in the past. But did Sam and Dean cause more deaths or save more deaths? And I think averting an apocalypse puts them, you know, thanks to them, the world is saved. And from that point on, I don't see.
Well,
Um,
I agree, but our brains don't really capture big numbers like that. I think it was Joseph Stalin that said one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic, or something along those lines.
yes, yeah,
So Sam and Dean saved 8 billion people by not letting the apocalypse happen. But what about that Kitsune who maybe
yeah,
didn't have to die?
yes. Psychologically, it's not good enough.
And those 8 billion people wouldn't have died at their hands. But that one person that they weren't fast enough they missed their shot or they shot the wrong person. That's the stuff that eats you alive at night.
Yes.
Because that's tangible. The 8 billion, I can't grasp that there are 8 billion people living on this planet at this very moment. I haven't met most of them. They're a concept.
That's right. And this is why in the news, when they tell a personal story, it's more apt for people to feel the concern. Oh, this happened to such and such. They got their identity stolen and blah blah blah. Oh, if you know somebody, that puts a bigger impression on you than all these statistics of,
Yeah.
clearly it might be the case that 9 out of 10 people have X virus. Until I know somebody that's got it, it's not going to make an impression.
Now, one of the other things I wanted to make sure to ask you, and there were so many in the book, I mean, it really was a fascinating take, and I love having things that make you look at something that has become familiar and look at it in a different way. But one of the sections was titled Evil by Design. And, going back to that idea of the antisocial monster, some of the creatures they ran into were just plain evil by design.
Yes. So I was looking into this, and when I was trying to figure out how responsible a werewolf was, or any given vampire was, most of them didn't choose to become the kinds of monsters that they are. And you can trace their lineage back to an alpha, and the alphas didn't choose to be alphas. They were created by Eve, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And Eve is sort of the mother of all monsters, and she made them that way. So she designed them to kind of be this, I don't, from one perspective, I guess some perversion of God's creation, but she created something different from, her vision of the world was something different. It was more wild. You can imagine in sorry, the where Eve came from.
Purgatory?
Yes, Purgatory. Sorry. I keep thinking Pandorum, and I'm like, no, that's a movie. That's something else.
Different fandom.
That's right. They, it's a wild place, and so those monsters in that wild, it's like going out in your woods.
But does that make them evil as opposed to someone like Alistair, who revels in his ability to cause pain, chooses to cause pain, as opposed to being a wild beast that really doesn't have another option? Which kind of cycles back to what we were talking about at the beginning.
So it's, yeah, it is where that moral responsibility gets very blurry. And it's not as easy to I guess it shines a light on the same sort of moral responsibility that we have. We can be monsters if we want to. And if we don't want to, we have to decide not to. And it's going to be work. It isn't as simple as, okay, well, I'm going to give more to charity. The ways in which we harm one another on a daily basis through choices that we don't even know, is horrific when you step back and realize that you could save a life for $300 just by providing fresh water to a child in a country where their water supplies will cause them to get dysentery and then die. That's a new phone that you didn't have to get, but you chose that new phone instead. You upgraded when you could have saved a life. You may say that's not your responsibility, but you're only kind of benefiting because you were lucky enough to live in a place that provided the opportunity to do that, and they just so happened to be born somewhere else. If you had happened to be born there, you'd be suffering the same sort of thing. And while we look at those monsters and we think that's a different sort of thing, it challenges you to think that those monsters are not necessarily all that different when you look at their reasons for what they're doing. Why did you kill and eat these people? Well, they were hungry, you know. So you might think of that as an analogy towards deciding whether or not to be a vegetarian, but that's not exactly it. It has to do with just in general. Did you need that, or could you have gotten by happily in another way?
Well, and also when you look at some of the hyper powered beings that we encounter in Supernatural, and borrowing from Spider-Man here, with great power comes great responsibility. What could you have what could the angels have done if they weren't having a corporate coup over who got to run heaven with all of that angel juice? So many creatures had the power to have done great things for good and didn't.
Yeah,
Didn't want to.
I think the angels are really interesting because they have such a top-down leadership and mentality, whereas the evil in the world, they're a lot more spread out and they do their own thing. In general, they look a lot more happy than the angels do. And it isn't until angels start to just live lives for themselves that they start deciding for themselves. From the outset, when you first meet Castiel, you're like, oh, well, this is kind of how I would imagine an angel. They would be very straight and narrow, and there just wouldn't be. And that kind of moral reasoning isn't reasoning, it's just following orders. And whereas evil, while it doesn't seem to stop, it doesn't seem to sit and think about whether or not it would do this. Some of it does. Some of those monsters do. Now, when you get to talking about some of the more powerful creatures, it's difficult for me to say how to handle them morally speaking, because it's sort of like trying to figure out how to handle Chuck morally speaking. We're not talking about creatures that have lived for 100 years. We're talking about creatures that have, in some cases, lived for thousands and thousands of years. So their perspective on what a human is and a human life is not all that different than our perspective of small animals and their lives. We just don't
Or
have.
insects.
Yeah, exactly. We don't. Most people don't give a whole lot of thought to the quality of the insect's life, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have some quality of life. Yeah, that.
Well, there's so much packed into this book, and I really enjoyed it, and I love having to stop and think and see things with fresh eyes. So thank you so much, Galen, for bringing the book to life and wrangling all your contributors for it. Tell us, please, where we can find you and the book online and social media and all that good stuff.
Well, you can find me on, I think I'm definitely on Facebook. Easy to find because there's not a whole lot of Galen Foresmans out there. And I don't do a whole lot of social media. I teach at North Carolina A&T State University, so you can always go to their website to find out more about me or call my office, which I won't answer because I'm at home. And um, people can email me there if they want to talk more. I would certainly enjoy that.
Well, thank you so much
Oh,
for,
I should say the book.
yes, the book.
I think that you can find it just about anywhere online.
It's definitely on
Yeah.
Amazon. So yeah, easy to find.
Oh, and it's in Portuguese, just in case.
Very cool.
I've got a copy. I can't read it, but
But they tell you that's what it is. Yeah.
that's right. I trust them.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank all of you for watching and listening. There'll be more Supernatural here on ConTinual. So I'll see you online.